You know, sometimes in nature photography, TTL flash is a great choice because we can get pictures like this. But other times in nature photography, manual flash is the better choice, and it allows us to do things like this. When should we use manual? When should we use TTL? And why? That's what I'm going to talk about today. Let's get into it. Hola amigos, Greg Basco here at my home office in Costa Rica. You know, one of the questions I'm asked most often by my workshop clients is, Greg, should I use my flash in TTL mode or in manual mode? It's a really good question, and the answer, like many things in life, is it depends. TTL flash mode offers a lot of flexibility, a lot of versatility, whereas manual flash mode offers the utmost in precision. And each one of those modes can benefit us in our nature photography depending on what's going on. A couple of months ago, I did a video called Basic Flash Functions for Nature Photography, where I go through how TTL and manual mode really work and how you can set them on your flashes. If you haven't done so already, I suggest you check that out. There's a link right below. But today, I want to work in my studio with you for a little bit and just run through some examples of how TTL flash and manual flash react to different situations. For instance, when our flash to subject distance stays the same, when that distance changes, and when we change our camera settings, especially aperture and ISO. And my goal with this little video is that you get a good sense of how they work and have a good foundation for making a judgment for yourself the next time you're out in the field as to whether TTL flash or manual flash mode will benefit you most. Let's get into the studio and check out TTL versus manual flash. All right, what I have set up here are a few of my favorite peppers. These are these big Rocoto Manzano peppers from the Andes. They're hot, but they are delicious, man. I'll tell you, you can stuff them, you can make them into sauce, whatever. But they make a really cool subject for our in the studio kind of test shots. So I have one of my beautiful Rocotos here on some white foam. I have another all the way on the right on some black foam. And then I have one lined up right in the middle, right in the intersection of those pieces of foam. I have my camera set so that I'm completely underexposing this scene, and so my flash is doing all of the work. And just a quick note here, I'm going to be using the flash direct on in the hot shoe, direct on axis flash. I hate this because here's what it looks like. And if I just bounced it off the ceiling, it looks so much better because now we have light coming from the top and it's a larger light source. I would never shoot things the way I'm shooting for an actual photo I would want to show anybody, but I'm going to make you guys look at it and I'm going to drill it into your heads that direct flash is really bad compared to bounced flash. Bounced flash isn't available to us outside in nature, so we don't think about it much as nature photographers. But just so you know, these are horrible pictures. And I'm telling you, I know they're horrible pictures, okay? But what I want to do with this scene, first off, is explore a little hypothesis. Remember I said TTL flash is all about versatility and flexibility because you have these fancy calculations going on between camera and flash. That's great. Whereas manual flash is all about consistency and precision because once I set the flash power, it will not change until I change that flash power. So one might hypothesize here with this little scene I have going that TTL might have a bit of trouble maintaining a consistent flash exposure on the red peppers as I move around against these different backgrounds and different settings that I have white, mixed white and black, whereas manual will definitely be able to maintain a consistent exposure on the peppers. So I'm going to do a little test and then we'll check back and see how it works. TTL flash saw those white surroundings and tried to make them gray and underexposed our pepper. When we got to the middle, it did a little bit better. The pepper is okay. And then on the black surroundings, it tried to make that black middle gray, brought the exposure up and really blew out the pepper. Manual flash mode, on the other hand, kept a consistent exposure on the pepper because the flash power isn't changing and isn't influenced by the surroundings. I'm the only one who can change the flash power in manual mode. Before we go any further, remember that TTL flash exposure compensation works on the same principle as exposure compensation, natural light, ambient light exposure compensation works in our camera. That is, it's calibrated to read things as a middle toned gray, right? As that kind of medium gray. So if we want to expose a brighter subject, we need to take our flash exposure compensation up. If we want to properly expose a darker subject with our flash, we would take our flash exposure compensation down. And so we want to be really nimble in terms of setting that on our flash and getting to know what the effects of it are. So like I said, before we go through into some increasingly more complex scenarios and questions, I want to just show you what TTL flash exposure compensation looks like as we change it with these peppers on the different backgrounds surrounding things. So I'm going to take some pictures and then we'll check those out. I know, you're thinking, why do I have to look at more of these blinding direct flash pepper pictures? Well, I'll tell you what, I wanted to show you how TTL flash exposure compensation worked, and I wanted it to be direct flash bouncing right off the object and the immediate surroundings so that there wasn't any influence of me bouncing it off the ceiling and everything like that. So you can see that when you have a basically middle toned object like my pepper is, even though it's bright red, it's sort of a middle tone, maybe slightly brighter than middle tone, but when it's surrounded by bright surroundings, the flash metering gets fooled and tends to underexpose the subject unless we add a lot of positive flash exposure compensation. Now, when we get into the scene where the pepper's right in the middle and the rest of the scene is about half black, half white, things look a little better and flash exposure compensation is able to keep up a bit better. Not bad. 0 is still a little bit dark, so it's still being fooled more by the white than by the black, I would say. Now, you might be thinking, why is this? Why doesn't it just meter the pepper and expose the pepper properly? Well, I'll tell you why that is. It's because TTL flash works in every system, as far as I know, every camera system, in evaluative or matrix metering. So it is taking into account the whole scene. You can't just spot flash meter on the pepper and have it dial in the flash just for that. So what's happening here is you're seeing, again, at 0 flash exposure compensation with the black surroundings, it's trying to make that gray and in the process overexposing the pepper. Now, since we have dark surroundings, we might take our flash exposure compensation down to -2, and that looks pretty true for the pepper. So that's how TTL flash works. You have to consider the whole scene. As we saw, TTL flash can have some problems when our subject is the same, but the surroundings vary widely in tone, let's say from white and black, because the TTL flash meter, all those calculations can get fooled, just like our camera meter can, and that's why we do exposure compensation, right? And so as you saw, we can easily control our flash exposure with TTL flash exposure compensation. So TTL has some issues, but here's an area where it has some advantages over manual flash, and that is when we're photographing a subject, but maybe we want to make some changes to our camera settings. Let's say with my peppers again, my rocoto manzano. I love saying that, I love eating them, but let's say I want a little more depth of field or a little less depth of field, or I decide, you know what, I don't need such a high ISO, I could take this down and get lower noise. Well, in manual flash, those are going to cause inconsistent and improper exposures from our flash because we've all of a sudden let in more or less of that flashlight bouncing off our subject and coming back and being recorded on the sensor because we've set the flash at a certain power, but now we've changed the aperture or the ISO. TTL flash, on the other hand, is again going to do those fancy calculations between the camera and flash and help the flash to output a proper exposure even though I've changed my aperture or my ISO. So I'm going to do a few photos here of my peppers where I'm changing my camera settings, just so you can see what that looks like. I'll do it with manual flash mode, and you can see how it causes some issues. And then I'm going to do it in TTL flash mode. Now, what variables on my camera am I going to change? I'm shooting in manual mode, producing a completely black exposure without my flash, right? And so I am only going to change aperture and ISO. Why don't I change shutter speed? It's because shutter speed has no effect on flash exposure. There are a couple of slight caveats to that, and there's some really tricky kind of explanations that go into answering why that's true, but just take my word for it for now. Aperture and ISO, not shutter speed, are the only variables that will affect your flash exposure. I will do a future video on this, but for now, I'll change aperture and ISO, and we'll see how TTL handles that situation versus manual flash. So at f5.6 and 1/16 power manual flash, things are looking good. But if I change to f4, now all of a sudden I'm one stop overexposed. And if I go to f8, now I'm one stop underexposed because now 1/16 power isn't enough. It works the same way in ISO. I was at ISO 100, ISO 200 is overexposed, ISO 64, as low as my camera goes, is now underexposed. TTL, we have a different story. I chose flash exposure compensation at +1, that's looking good. I changed from f5.6 to f4, same exposure. From f4 to f8, basically the same exposure, maybe just the slightest variation. And again, as I vary the ISO from 100 to 200, exposure stays the same. As I go down to ISO 64, the exposure stays the same. So TTL is better for this. What if instead of changing our camera settings, we have a situation where our camera settings are going to stay the same, but maybe our subject is moving around or we're moving around. That is, our flash to subject distance is changing. I have my flash in the hot shoe here, and this is exactly the kind of thing a nature photographer would encounter when doing long lens work, because most often we'll have our flash in a telephoto flash bracket that is essentially direct flash, and our flash is moving with us, right? So if we have a bird flying back and forth, monkeys moving around, those are the things I encounter here at least, and our flash to subject distance is going to be changing. Or maybe I want to back up for a more wide kind of environmental shot, maybe with a bird or a mammal subject in that. The same thing is going on. The flash to subject distance is changing. TTL is going to allow us to keep up with that because, again, all those calculations going on are going to make sure that the flash puts out the proper exposure given the situation. But you might already be guessing that manual is going to give us some real problems here. And in fact, those problems are going to be related to something we call the inverse square law. I'm about 1 foot away from the peppers here. So I'm going to do a series of images where I shoot them at 1 foot away and then I move back to 2 feet away. I'll zoom in so that the composition stays the same, the flash metering stays the same for the TTL and all that stuff. We'll have a nice controlled scientific experiment, right? But you can already guess that as we move farther away, manual flash is going to give us problems because our previously correct manual flash exposure at 1 foot away from our subject is no longer correct because we've moved farther back. The inverse square law tells us that every time we double the distance of a light source to its subject, the amount of that light falling on the subject falls off by a factor of 4, or that subject is receiving now only 25% of the light it was previously. In photographic terms, as we talk about it, that means 2 stops of light. So every time I move back, let's say from 1 foot to 2 feet away, I'm going to have to add 2 stops of flash power back to my flash to maintain the same exposure I had before. You can imagine how much of a headache this would be out in the field, trying to get a tape measure out. Stay still, monkey, tape measure, let's see what we can do. But I mean, just trying to calculate these distances all the time would be a major hassle out in the field. TTL, even though it's not going to be perfect, is going to keep us in the ballpark, and it's a much better option. So let's take a look at these pictures and you'll see exactly why that is. At 1 foot away, manual flash at 1/32nd power is doing a good job. It's a little bit bright, but I think that's appropriate. Again, the white should be white and the pepper should be nice and bright. So I'm happy with this. But what happens when I move 2 feet away? Remember the inverse square law. I've doubled my distance now and I've lost 75% of the light falling on the scene. So 1/32nd power now at 2 feet away leaves me 2 stops underexposed. How could I remedy that in manual flash? I'd have to know that I've just moved back twice the original distance and I need to add back in 2 stops of flash power, so I would set my flash to 1/8 power. TTL flash, on the other hand, I've set flash exposure compensation to +1, brighten it up, that's looking good at 1 foot away, and it's also looking good at 2 feet away, because again, the flash and the camera are going to make those calculations to keep the exposure the same. Now, what if we have our flash off camera? Again, I don't mean on a telephoto flash bracket, that's effectively on camera flash. I mean completely untethered from our camera. I have here a Godox X Pro flash transmitter, a wireless flash transmitter, and then I've placed my flash over here on the table very close to the pepper. So now I can move around as I want to, and TTL flash is going to work just fine. Manual flash is going to work just fine because the flash to subject distance is not changing. What if our pepper moves? They probably wouldn't do that, but what if it moved back? Now all of a sudden in manual flash, we are not going to have enough power to properly expose that. By the same token, if that pepper moved closer to the flash, again in manual flash mode, our exposure is going to change. So in the case where we have our flash off camera but our subject is moving, TTL flash is still probably going to be a better choice. But what if I'm holding the flash myself? That is, I have my camera here, I'm using a wireless flash transmitter, and I'm holding the flash, or maybe I have a friend holding a flash. This is something we do a lot in macro photography so that we can keep up with the moving subject, maybe a little frog jumping around the rainforest floor, something like that. It's nice to have your hands free, or at least one hand free. I'll hold my camera with one hand, autofocus with my back button, and hold the flash. Again, if I have a friend and they'll hold the flash for me, even better, right? But in that case, we do have another issue, because let's pretend I'm holding my flash, and I'll just grab it, and I'm 6 inches away from my subject. That's a great way to do macro work, because the effectively larger your light source is in relation to your subject, the softer the kind of light you're going to get. Topic for a future video. Again, there are a lot of future video topics coming out of this. But again, let's say I have it 6 inches away from my subject, and then, I don't know, my hand starts to drift, I get a little tired, all of a sudden it's 12 inches away. Well, inverse square law again, and we have an exposure problem. I'm going to have to be changing my manual flash power to maintain a proper exposure every time that my flash moves away from my subject. Remember, the inverse square law works at close distances just like it does at far distances. You can't outrun physics, right? So for this kind of photography where you're holding the flash or somebody else is holding the flash and you're moving around to keep up with a moving subject, I like to use TTL. I just think it keeps us in the ballpark better and allows me to do what I want to do. And of course, it gives me the freedom also if I decide, you know what, I want to stop down to f16 for this shot of a frog, get some really nice depth of field. But for the next one, I want to open up to f2.8 for this more kind of dreamy look. Again, as long as I have a good flash exposure compensation going on, I don't have to change the value of that, even though I want to do something different creatively, shot to shot. At this point, you might be thinking to yourself, Greg, if TTL flash is so great, apart from some slight inconsistencies, why would I ever want to use manual flash? Well, there are two reasons. One is the matter of those little inconsistencies. It can be a real pain sometimes. TTL flash can be fooled, especially by reflective subjects, by shiny things in the backgrounds, by lots of, as you saw here, kind of mixed backgrounds, white. So it can be problematic. When I do have problems getting a proper exposure using TTL flash, I'll just go over into manual mode, and then I'll know that, okay, 1/16 is good, and I'm ready to go. But the second and much more important reason for you using manual flash is that in manual flash, we know, or have a very good idea at least, of the flash duration. The flash output is dependent not on intensity of light coming out, but rather on the duration of that flash pulse. Just take a look at this table right here that gives you some ideas at different flash powers of studio strobes and kind of hot shoe flashes like we would use more often for nature photography. But you can see at higher powers, the duration is longer. At lower powers, the duration is shorter. This is what's going on in TTL, by the way, as well. +1, +2, +3 flash exposure compensation is going to mean a longer flash duration than -2 or -3. But in TTL flash, we don't know what that duration is. Like I said, you can look up a table just like this, and I'll know that at 1/16 power, my flash duration is maybe only 1/10,000th of a second. Why is that important? It's if I want to use flash for stopping action. Let's say for hummingbirds, for bats, all sorts of moving subjects like that, for those cool pictures of bullets going through water balloons that you see in a studio. Those are all done with manual flash because you can use a low power and know the duration of that flash and thus the action stopping power. All right, cool. That was pretty fun. I hope you learned a few things and that you're going to be more comfortable deciding whether to use TTL or manual flash mode the next time you're out in the field. If you did like this video, be sure to hit the like button, of course, but more importantly, subscribe, and you'll be notified the next time I post a video. If you want to learn even more about Flash, I suggest you check out my new ebook, Flash for the Nature Photographer, over 350 pages of really, really detailed information, along with behind the image stories with some of my favorite images that I've taken with Flash. And if you want to get my free quick flash guide, it's a downloadable PDF, just go to my website, deepgreenphotography.com, subscribe to my newsletter, monthly behind the image stories, photo tips, all sorts of stuff. I'll leave a link below down there too. So thanks for joining me. Stay safe, everybody. Keep on flashing, and I'll see you next time.